G'day, ZiggyD here. You guys seem to enjoy the last discussion video I did, and I love rambling, so let's do another one. This time let's talk about the upcoming Fractured and Synthesized items in the coming 3.6 expansion. Now, crafting has been getting both substantially more powerful and more interesting over the past few major leagues in Path of Exile. My biggest highlights and most memorable experiences in the last league were mostly crafting related. That's the stuff I remember the most out of Betrayal. Making some insane energy shield gear and crafting a crazy cast on crit bow will be memories that stick with me for a while. Let's look back a little bit over Path of Exile's crafting history. The game started with a pretty strong base, with the game's currency system being implicitly tied to the crafting of items, a brilliant move by ZiggyD to combat things like gold uselessness and so on, but make overall a much more interesting system. And it provided a pretty strong set of processes that you could follow to make items. You could alchemy or chaos spam to play the RNG to effectively simulate dropping a ton of the same kind of item over and over until you got something good. Or you could take the more deterministic route of using alterations, regaling, and exalting to try and tailor craft something much more specific. It's been a pretty good foundation overall on which ZiggyD has been able to build upon. The base was expanded pretty majorly with the implementation of master crafting. That gave baselines for things that you could always add to an item, like you knew you could always get some extra life, a mediocre amount, but you could always get it. You could always get some extra resists and so on. But more importantly, it added meta crafting mods, which allow you to change the way you used regular currency to deterministically craft items. Exalting got a lot more powerful when you can lock your prefixes or suffixes in place to only remove and replace specific mods. Elder and Shaper bases served to further expand upon this by giving rare and powerful mods you would specifically aim for in crafting, some real chase modifiers. Like, for example, you would alteration spam until you get Warlord's Mark on an Elder ring, and then regal and exalt, or use the meta crafting to add the rest of your mods and make a very powerful and valuable item. Now, some systems were added over time that somewhat replaced regular crafting methods, like for example essences or fossils that either guarantee or heavily influence which mods can be rolled, in addition to adding new chase mods to the crafting pool. And certainly in some ways, the use of regular currency in its original fashion has fallen off. You weren't likely to be chaos spamming a chest armor too often when you could instead use fossils that are much more likely to roll the mods you want, in addition to offering more powerful mods than you could ever get via chaos orbs. However, these systems, especially fossils, still effectively plugged into the expanding crafting toolset overall. So while you might complain of things like chaos spamming not being much of a thing anymore, if you look at crafting as a whole, these still plugged into it really well. You can now use a combination of fossils, elder or shaper bases, meta master crafting, and some hopeful exalting to give you a means by which to create some truly unique items. And some of these items' power level is even surpassing that of commonly held best in slot uniques. Now personally, I love the way this has been trending. Sure, it is a bit of a shame that we've lost a bit of the original intention of some currencies like Chaos Orbs, but we've gained something far deeper and more engaging over time. And sure, there's been power creep, but it's exactly 100% the right kind of power creep. The kind of power creep that comes with giving you a real long-term, aspirational goal and exciting new ways to gear your character out. You're not just equipping items with basic life and res and damage now, and then grinding currency to buy some endgame unique for your build. Now you have some serious next steps to consider if you want to continue playing that character, and that's kept me playing characters longer and longer each league. Now this whole ramble is to say that I'm very excited to see that ZiggyD is thinking deeply about ways that they can add systems that expand and slot into the crafting systems we already have. Because 3.6's fractured and more importantly synthesized items look set to do just that, and it's got me pretty keen. So, fractured items drop from synthesis monsters inside of the memory zones we'll be playing in 3.6. They have 1, 2, or Beck said rarely even 3 locked in place modifiers. You can craft these items, like for example with a Chaos Orb, and these stats will remain as they are. Perhaps this will see a bit of a rise of Chaos Orb use maybe. Though it seems more likely overall that if you find a good fractured item, you'd want to use it as a base to fossil craft or mastercraft the rest of the way. Now, fractured items will definitely be a case-by-case basis in terms of crafting. If you find a chest with good life locked on it, it might just be something you use while leveling or at early endgame. You're not really going to want to invest too much into that. You'd only really want to invest large amounts of currency if you found something with one of the really valuable and rare mods locked into place, like for example a flaring physical damage roll on a popular physical weapon base. And even in that case, you'd probably at least want one other good stat locked onto the item as well. This is just because the locked mod essentially has to save you enough currency on a basic item crafting project that you would normally want to tackle. When you keep in mind the power you can get out of Elder and Shaper bases, the locked mods really have to present you an opportunity to save some serious crafting costs. On that note, it seems likely that fractured items won't be able to drop as Shaper or Elder bases. Chris all but confirmed this on a recent podcast. As a result, fractured items are effectively offering you a relatively vanilla crafting opportunity with some potential saved costs. Now, most of the time, the locked mods will be pretty bad, and most of the time they're simply going to be a stepping stone towards the new synthesized items. So overall, I'm not too excited for fractured items specifically. I don't think we'll be seeing too much out of them overall, with maybe the occasional Reddit post or stream highlight of someone finding an insane locked 3 stat on a meta base that then gets crafted into a really good but relatively mundane item. What I am really excited about, however, is those synthesized items you make from your fractured ones. Synthesized items are offering a whole host of new implicit modifiers for every item type, even jewels, and other bases that don't often have implicits. Unlike Valorbs, these give you an item you can then craft around, while Valorbs are instead the final step in the crafting process. Now, there are some restrictions in how synthesis items slot into existing crafting systems. Firstly, you cannot chance synthesized items. This means no crazy versions of popular uniques with these insane implicits. And secondly, again, it seems fairly confirmed that we won't be seeing Shaped or Elder synthesized items, since this system is entirely disconnected from maps where those items actually drop. Now, this could be seen as disappointing, but there's a big upside to this. Choice. These mods are powerful, and instead of just adding to what you can do, you now have choices. Do you want to go for a unique item, an Elder or Shaper rare, or a synthesized rare with one of the new implicits? Since you'll still be able to fossil, essence, and mastercraft synthesis items, along with what we've seen so far of their power level, I think there's a strong potential these will be able to put up some decent competition against uniques and Elder Shaper rares for some builds. And this will lead to more diversity and more interesting niches in the crafting space, and if we're lucky, maybe some even more build diversity. So, let's take a brief look at some of these implicits and weigh them up. This is kind of what's been revealed so far. The basic and likely most common things you'll be seeing will be simple stuff like this: extra life and resistance. Most chest armors don't have implicits, so this is straight up raw stat gain. The only real comparison implicit-wise here is astral plates which have 12% all resistance as an implicit. I rate the life res implicit that you see here as more powerful at the higher end of gearing because there is no cap on how much life you can have, unlike resistances. But overall, potentially they're pretty close in power. Things get a lot more interesting from here on out though. Here we have a pair of boots with just Onslaught. You have it. Now there are plenty of ways of getting Onslaught these days, but Perma Onslaught that potentially frees up a flask slot is a very solid implicit indeed. I mentioned it in my first video, but here you can see another example of the enchants now being separate to the implicits on an item so that you can indeed have both. Next up, we have a belt with increased life recovery rate. If you're not familiar with this stat, it is quite powerful, as it's effectively a multiplier to all overtime healing, whether it's flasks, regen, or leech. This is highly sought after for Righteous Fire builds, max leech builds, and it's good for just about any life build. The most apt competition here is the 40 life implicit on a leather belt, and while that's tough competition, this definitely wins out most of the time. We'll have to see what other mods spawn in terms of comparing them with some of the other belt implicits available. Next up, even jewels are getting some love here. Jewels currently only have a very small handful of corrupted implicits, though there were some more added recently, with corrupting blood immunity being an example of one of the better ones. Since builds usually have 3 to 5 jewels, a few of these are definitely going to be something to aim for in the long term. As for this particular mod here, spell damage leached as energy shield, well, it is insane. Usually this is a difficult and high investment to obtain sort of stat, and it can be a huge survivability boost on ES builds. I'd even say this implicit is as powerful, if not more so, than most actual dual mods. So this effectively can allow you to make a 5-stat rare dual. I imagine the balancing point here is that in order to actually get this, you likely have to have 3 fractured rare jewels, not to mention potentially fractured rare jewels with the right stats to be able to spawn this particular implicit. This is both an exciting and potentially rather rare thing to do. I do suspect that there's a mod on the memory fragments, I think I may have seen one, that causes synthesis monsters to drop extra jewels, which will probably be the main way that you can actually farm these. As a side note, fractured jewels will probably be the best fractured items overall, hands down. Jewels only have 4 mods, and even having one decent one locked in place would make chaos spamming into a very good jewel quite feasible. I love jewel crafting, but have been doing less and less of it in favour of other crafting lately, so I'm excited to see this potentially bring it back in a big way. Now next up, there's a helmet here with some mana and, more importantly, 1% max fire resistance. This is a rather important one and somewhat surprising given all the reductions we've seen to the availability of this particular stat. Maximum resistance has been nerfed so much because it's a huge reduction to damage you take, and people were even making completely damage immune characters. Obviously a bit of a problem. So, this stat is obviously quite good. Something I like here is that on helmets, there are some awesome physical damage taken as elemental damage mods you can mastercraft that you can match to your extra boosted resistance for some really nice damage mitigation. Like you could get physical damage taken as fire if you've got max fire res. Now next up, Bex revealed this claw a little while back with faster poison damage on it. It's kinda meh. It front loads your damage a bit more and makes your poison stat kill enemies faster, but it's arguable whether, and maybe this is a hot debate, but whether this is actually a damage boost, since poisons do indeed stack. Something like this on Ignite is very good, but much less so on Poison. Most damning perhaps though is that this example highlights trading off the life gain on hit implicit from a claw, and in many cases I'd rate that mod as more powerful, particularly in a Poison build. This brings up the topic that weapons are probably where synthesis implicits will struggle the most to compete. Crit chance, crit multi, life gain on hit, elemental damage on scepters, and so on are all tough competition, so we're going to need to see some really strong implicits from synthesis, just straight up more powerful ones, or really build specific stuff. I hope for more of the latter. Now earlier I spoke of Warlord's Mark Elder rings being a big thing in the competition between Elder shaped rares and synthesis rares. This is perhaps the single greatest example of that choice aspect I was speaking of. Here we have a flammability on hit ring. Now this is way weaker than Warlord's Mark on hit, sure, but different builds want this compared to Warlord's Mark. If there is a few other curses you can get on rings like this, then we'll definitely be seeing these as a chase item for specific builds that want an easy way to have that curse applied. Compared to ring implicits, which are life, crit, elemental damage, and physical damage, and resists, this definitely beats them out in most cases, unless of course you just don't need your curse in this manner. And certainly in some cases a steel ring is going to be a lot better for your build than one of these curses. It's a pretty good one overall, and I'm really happy to see such a direct example of synthesis versus Elder Shaper in action on this item. Here we've got some more curse love on a shield this time, Conductivity Curse Effect. Curse Effect is a very powerful stat. In this case it's basically some more damage, and it's likely more damage than you'd get from the shield's spell damage implicit. In other cases, something like Enfeeble or Temporal Chains if those exist, implicits like these would be super strong. Amulet's implicits are mainly main stats, and can be a problem solver, but they're rarely super impactful on your build unless you're specifically chasing after stacking one of those stats. Mana Reservation Reduction is much more powerful than main stats, no question, so long as that's actually important for your build. Mana Reservation is one of those stats where it's insanely good if you're stacking auras, while it's almost useless if you aren't stacking enough of the mana reduction to be able to run another aura. There's effectively a breakpoint there. So it's a niche but powerful stat here. Last up we have this shield with 2 minimum frenzy charges. This mod means you always have at least 2 frenzy charges, but they cannot be spent. Sorry, but that means no infinite flicker strike from this mod in particular. Most builds that are stacking frenzy charges will be at max all of the time, so this mod is useless for those builds. But frenzy charges are pretty strong, and builds that otherwise struggle to maintain them in boss fights, for example, or who don't want to run Blood Rage or Poacher's Mark, will appreciate this mod. And in most cases, it's probably going to be preferable to most shield implicits. Now, that's talking about like the intended use of this. If we stray away from the intended use, this gets a little more interesting though. If you have this on a weapon swap, you can swap to it for a brief fraction of a second and then swap back, and voila, you have 2 frenzy charges instantly. So this could be used to simply pre-stack 2 frenzy charges in an offhand slot before you start a boss fight. So that's kind of cute. Now, before we move on to my final thoughts, I have a bit of a note here. I was chatting to Chris Wilson about the topic of power creep, and in particular with these items, and I know it's something that keeps coming up whenever there's powerful new stuff added to the game. So firstly, Chris has talked about a few times how it's intentional that there's some level of creep in terms of giving new things and new powerful stuff for people to aspire to, new ways for people to make their builds better. Overall, Chris expects that from these items, there'll be something like a 10 to 15% creep in power on these items that these mods can appear on specifically. So it was interesting to hear that they're kind of like specifically measuring and estimating out the amount of power creep each new edition adds. Here's a quote from what Chris told me about their ideas on power creep and how it fits into the game. So Chris said, "Our goal is so that each expansion you're capable of making slightly better items than before, with some important caveats. 1, that previous amazing items are still capable of handling the highest content, so a user who works hard for good items in a league doesn't feel like their work is totally invalidated in the next league. And then 2, a user who takes a break for a few leagues doesn't feel that stuff has progressed too far without them, so they can effectively come back, I guess. And then 3, it should require a lot of effort and or luck to reach these new best items." So that's kind of interesting. It's more about adding a new top end to aspire to, and that does seem consistent with the last few sets of additions, though some of them have certainly empowered the bottom end a lot and made things like leveling and such much more easier, but it's arguable as to whether those sorts of things are much of a problem. Anyhow, I thought that was interesting extra information. Looking at things overall, most of these implicits from the synthesis items are certainly stronger than any other implicit options, and many of them are downright powerful or even chase. I think they'll compete pretty decently against Elder and Shaper rares, but long term, I still think Elder and Shaper rares will win out because you can craft multiple powerful and Elder Shaper mods on a single item. Jewels are probably the most powerful one overall, and I hope we have a solid pool of implicits to draw from because it'll really breathe new life into jewel crafting, and there's some solid design space there that's open to give us some new tools to refine our builds with. In terms of that topic of power creep, because this seems so choice-oriented, I wouldn't be surprised if there even is as much power creep as Chris was estimating at the top end. But we'll have to see how it all comes together once we have the full picture of all of the mods available and how it slots into exactly the existing crafting systems. So overall, I'm really looking forward to exploring this some more when the League actually comes out. I can't wait to get my hands just dirty crafting some filthy rares. But let me know what you make of it all. How do you guys think the synthesis mods will hold up, and how do you feel about the direction of crafting in PoE overall? That's it for now. I'm ZiggyD, and thanks for watching.